Okay, so now I'm going to introduce to you the if-let statement. Now this is something pretty unique to Swift 3. It's a way to test to see if an optional variable has a value. So we look briefly at optional variables. I'm just going to recap what an optional variable is in the tutorial itself, and we're going to explain exactly what the if-let statement is. So this is different from the other if statements in that it's not actually running a test of equality, it's just testing to see if an optional variable has a value or not. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the special kind of if statement called an if-let statement. And now this only really applies to what we call optional variables. So just a brief recap, an optional variable, let's call this optional 1, and we'll give it the type string, doesn't really matter though. And this is how we declare an optional variable. Okay, so we give it a name and a type, and then we add the question mark on the end. Now this just means that we haven't given it a value and we don't know if we will. So for example, think about if we're entering someone's information and we have like a height option or something, but we don't know what the height is. Well, we don't want to put 0 because that would mean the height is 0 and you can't be 0 meters tall. But if we add this question mark, then it just kind of contains a nil value as we see here, which means it doesn't really have a value, but it's not a 0, or it's not an empty string in this case. Okay, so we can then reassign this if we want. So optional 1 equals hello, and it will reassign the value, and then we could print it out again, optional 1, and it will be hello from here on out. And then if we really want, we can reassign it optional 1 the value of nil, and it goes back to nil. However, you can only do this with optional variables. If this was something like hi, then we can't do that. We can't reassign it to contain nil. We can do all of this other stuff, but not the nil part. Okay? So that's just something that you can do with optional variables. I'm going to change this back. And what you can do is you can also assign values to optional variables right away, but that's a little pointless. Why even bother declaring it as optional if you know what the value is right off the bat? Okay, so that's what an optional variable is. It's basically just a way to assign a variable without assigning a value yet. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and know if I should keep this. I'll keep it, and if it's kind of messing with people, in fact, no, I'm going to get rid of it because it's going to mess up the rest of the tutorial. So what we want to do is with this if-let, we're testing to see if our optional variable has a value. So that's all it is. It's not testing to see if something's equal to something else. It's just testing to see if it has a value. Now in this case, because we're in Playground and we get the values kind of displayed to our right here, it's not necessary. However, if you're developing an app using pretty much anything other than Playground, you'd have to use print statements, and it gets pretty complicated to figure out the value. So that's where these if-let comes in, or these if-let statements come in handy. So we're just going to call if-let, and then we could have some variables, so some, let's say definite 1, kind of the opposite of optional 1. So if it equals optional 1, then let's create a variable message, and this one's going to be a type string, and we're just going to declare this as optional also because we don't want it to have a value yet. We're just going to have message equal, I don't know, hello or something, and then just get message print out down there. Okay, so look at this test here. So we're testing to see, this is the only thing, the if-let is not testing if something is really equal to something, it's not testing equality or anything. It's not like a traditional if statement. It's just testing to see if optional 1 has a value. So we're saying if we did create this variable definite 1, or this constant definite 1, and we set it equal to optional 1, would it have some kind of a value or would it just be nil? And if it is, then if it does contain a value, then we'll just execute this code. And if optional 1 is indeed a true optional with no value, then we won't execute this code. And that's exactly what's happening here. So we're testing to see if optional 1 has a value. So again, that's all this is doing. As optional 1 has no value, oops, don't want to do that. As optional 1 has no value right now because we just declared it to be a nil string, then this code doesn't execute, and so message does not equal to hello. However, if we gave this a value, something like 5, or well, it's a string, so we should give it something like hi. And just going to let it run, it's taking its time. Then we get all this stuff changing, so we get message equal to hello and message. And this is because optional 1 now contains a value. So this passes, and the code here executes. Okay? So that's what an if left statement does, and that's all it does, okay? Is it's just testing to see if our optional variable here on the right hand side has a value. That's all it's doing. Okay? If this wasn't an optional, then we get an error. And this error is saying that we need to have some kind of optional binding. Okay? So it doesn't work with definite variables, only with optionals. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. This is a good way to test to see if your optionals have values if you're not sure or not, without having to do a bunch of print statements. So while you're in the playground, again, it's not really necessary because we can just do this. And it contains, well, I mean, we assigned it the value there, but it basically tells us whether it's nil or not. But that's only in playground, and you can't really do that if you're using the Xcode to develop apps or something like that. You have to use these statements. So again, just a good way to test to see if an optional variable contains a value or not. Okay, so that's all this is. Just saying if we could let this variable contain the value that's here, then we'll do this. But if it really is, if it has no value, then nothing in this executes. So if it's nil, which is in this case, then nothing happens, okay? So that's just the if let statement. Again, just testing to see if the optional variable has a value. Alright, so if you're creating these optional variables, it might be a good practice to kind of get in the habit of doing this if let statement, having that if let statement pertaining to that optional variable somewhere in the code, so that you always have a way of knowing whether it's nil or not. Alright, so that's the if let statement for you. And the next part will just be kind of like a brief recap of what we've learned so far. Okay, so in this part we introduced the if let statement to you. So this was just a way that we could see if an optional variable has a value. So we created an optional variable, and it was a string, and we just assigned it, we didn't assign it a value to start off with, and then we created this if let statement, and just to test to see if it had a value. If it did, we changed the string that was message to say something like hello. Okay, so this only works with optional variables, and it's just, again, just a way to see if we have assigned a value to that variable or if it just contains nil. Because if it just contains nil, then we get nothing within the curly braces executing, whereas if we've assigned it a value, then we execute the stuff within the curly braces. Okay, so in Playground it's not necessary because we kind of get the values of the variables appear on the right hand side, but in pretty much any other IDE you don't really get that, so you need to be running these tests every time you create an optional variable. So it's different from the other if statements in that the if statements were kind of testing some kind of equality, so if one variable is equal to another, if one variable is greater than another, whereas these if let statements aren't actually running that equality test. It's just testing to see if the optional variable has a value. Alright, so this is the final part of our tutorial, and we're just going to do a brief summary of what we've seen so far. Okay, so we've seen if statements where we have an if, then we have some kind of condition to test, and then if that test passes, then we'll have some kind of code to execute. And I'm just going to put these all in comments. So this is a basic if state. In fact, you know what, I'm going to leave the comments out because I'll be modifying this a bit. So we have, basically a condition to test. If this test passes, then we execute this code. If it doesn't, then we don't execute the code and we skip over. We saw it does this every time. We saw testing two conditions where we have an if and then we have condition 1 and condition 2. So and then code to execute. And so basically condition 1 and condition 2 have to be true in order for this code to execute if there's this ampersand. And we had the or operator where either both or at least one had to be true. And then we looked at nested if statements where we had an if and then a condition 1, and then an if and then condition 2. And basically we tested first one condition, then we could do something like execute some other code. And then we have condition 2 and then execute code if both tests pass. Okay, so this was the good thing about having the nested ifs rather than testing two at once, is that you could basically have some code run even if this condition doesn't pass. Okay. Then we looked at else if statements. So we had an if condition 1 and then some kind of code to execute, and then else if condition 2, and this is code to execute only if condition 1 fails. Okay, if I can actually type. Cool, so that's the else if, and then we had an else statement where we have if condition 1, and then we'll have some kind of code to execute, and then we have an else, and then this is going to be code to execute if condition 1 fails, and basically we run no other test. Okay, so with the else statement, it was just kind of a way to encompass all other possibilities. If condition 1 fails, then we want something to happen. Okay, whereas with the else if, then we could have nothing happening if both tests fail. Okay, so that's the difference between these two. Else is something is going to happen regardless. Else if is something still might not happen. Okay, and lastly we looked at the else or the if-let statements, and this was basically test to see if a optional variable has a value, and this is code to run if optional variable has value. And if optional variable has no value, then we don't run this code and we just leave. So these are the if statements we've seen so far. We've gone from basic ifs to two conditions in one if, to nested ifs, to else ifs, to elses, to if-lets. Okay, so if there are any parts that you're still unsure about, I strongly urge you to go back and watch them. If statements are used throughout code in any language, I'm pretty sure, has if statements. So it's really important to understand these and understand the subtle differences between them, because although they're all fairly similar, well, with the exception of the if-let, there are differences, and so without knowing those differences, you could be making a lot of mistakes in your code. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching our tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it, and we'll also be creating tutorials on stuff like for loops. We'll be talking about arrays, and we'll be talking about functions and stuff like that. So check those out, and otherwise, thanks again for watching, and hopefully we will see you next tutorial.